had a passion for a while, and I've titled it Watch, Do Not Be Deceived. And we're going to start with Daniel. We'll work our way through Daniel. Then we're going to pick up what we need to out of Zechariah and parts from, we'll have verses pretty much from Daniel going forward. And certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke will carry a lot of the weight on this, as well as we'll get into the 2 Thessalonians and the Corinthians and the letters from Paul telling about what's going to happen. And then we get into Revelation. We'll end with Revelation. Last time we just did Revelation, and as needed I found things in the other books and pulled them in, and that helped us understand a little bit of Revelation, but it wasn't like we laid a good foundation. And that was the thing that I really wanted to do this time. But in looking at it, I wanted to come, it's something that I think takes a different level. To me, the reason for having a study like this is that deception is real. And it's something that we have to think about. No one is immune. And the study that we're looking at, everything is repeated in Mark and Luke, as well as what I will see in Matthew chapter 24. And I think it's a responsibility of Christians to know the truth. We really should know what's going on. And Jesus warned us, as he warned his disciples in Matthew 24:4, and then the same thing, the same verses in the other two Gospels. Watch out that no one deceives you. And this is something that, as Christians, it's easy to think that, we've been in church all our lives. We've listened to all kinds of sermons. We've listened to everything. We're not going to be among the ones that gets deceived. And the things that we think about are the things of today, where you see, every time you see an article and there's some technologies that exist where people can take a hypodermic gun and shoot a little chip in your finger, and you can do your banking with it. You can do things, and they've got little things for your identities like this. And the first thing we do is we think of that mark of the beast, and so that's what bothers us. But there's a lot of things we don't understand and a lot of things that we don't know about. And so when I thought about the concept of deception, when we think of it, Satan's power in this world is the power to deceive. And that's what he uses against us more than anything else. And so when you go all the way back, the whole Bible is based on the deception. The deception that started with Adam and Eve. Because, and when you think about Adam and Eve and you think about how subtle deception can be, and how we can be arrogant enough to think it's not going to happen to us. This is Adam and Eve. And if you remember, Adam walked in the afternoons every day with God. This was the last time God was on earth, other than when Jesus came in the human form. But God himself walked with Adam in the Garden of Eden and spent time with Adam in the Garden of Eden. And so if God himself wasn't enough to keep Adam and Eve from being deceived, you can see how hard we have to really work at not being deceived. And then I thought about Joshua and the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites come to Joshua. And this is the Joshua that was with Moses, and he was the general, and he spent 40 years of seeing the manna and everything. He's one of the two. He and Caleb were allowed to go into the promised land. Joshua is the general, and he's leading them in. And everything he does, he goes to the Lord in prayer before he does everything except this. And these people come over the mountains, and they've got these worn out wineskins, and they've got things, and they've put on tattered clothes. All they did was cross over the hill, all right? And they come to him, and it looks like they've traveled for months to get there. And that was the impression they wanted to create. And so he agrees right then to a treaty to them that he only finds out 3 or 4 days later that they had deceived him. But they had deceived him, and so he honored his commitment. But then it says that they were able to deceive him because they made this treaty with the Gibeonites, and the Bible tells us they did not go to the Lord on this. The elders did not consult the Lord on this. They didn't turn to God this one time, and look at what it did. And so when we think about this, mostly we deceive ourselves by not being aware of the things that are going on. And so as I wanted to look at this and build a foundation for this study, I looked at Matthew 23, right before chapter 24, to understand where Jesus is and what Jesus is doing. Jesus is talking to the disciples, And he's talking to the Pharisees, and he's talking to the scribes at this time. And this is where he goes through. Chapter 23 is when he goes through all the woes for the Pharisees and the scribes and the rabbis, and he's talking to these people. And in 23, 1 and 2, Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you to do. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Okay? So you can listen to the leaders, you can listen to the teachers, you can do these things, but the best thing is don't do what these people are doing. That's what Jesus is warning him. He continues in 37 through 39, and he tells them, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you, how often he has longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are not willing. Look, your house is left desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this is setting us up for Matthew 24:4. And we get into 24:4, and it starts off, Jesus was sitting at the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, and they said, tell us, when will this happen? Because they've just listened to Jesus. He's just walked past in the first 3 verses and tells them that not one stone's going to be sitting on top of another one. That naturally piques their curiosity. So they ask him these 3 questions. When will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so Jesus starts this discourse with them. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and I will deceive many. In 24:15 and 16, this is where it comes to. It goes through this part, and it tells us, he says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. And then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And one of the things, this particular verse catches my attention more than any, because this is when we're going to start with Daniel. And Daniel talks about this abomination that causes desolation. But the interesting thing is, and this is how you have to really pay attention to what's going on and understand a bigger picture than just the verse here. Jesus says this, but then if you read every commentary I've been reading, talks about what we're going to look at and the 4 beasts, and it talks about the desolation in Daniel. It tells us that they think that was Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, he died in 165 BC, according to the records. Why would Jesus warn his disciples about somebody that died 200 years ago? Why would you warn them about somebody that died 200 years ago? You wouldn't. But it says in the commentaries, most scholars agree that this was Antiochus Epiphanes IV and from the Seleucid Empire. Why would they all think that it relates to him when Jesus is telling it to his disciples? And how could it be the same one if he died 200 years ago? You wouldn't think you had to worry too much about him by now. So this hasn't happened yet. It tells us in 25, for false messiahs and prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. And so when you look at this, this is something we tend to think of, the Jim Joneses and the people with David Koresh and all of these people. But there's a key part to this that comes in. It says, and they will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive. Well, David Koresh and Jim Jones and none of these other people that we like to think of as false messiahs that I know of ever did any great works and wonders. They never did anything that would deceive the believer because they didn't work any miracles. They just, they gathered people to them. So it's a little bit different. We may not have seen the false messiahs that he's talking about at this point. But one of the things we want to keep in mind is that, and this is the point I want to make from the beginning, and I'm going to try and remind you so many times as we go through this, is an angel has not appeared and given me a true interpretation of what's coming. All I have is the Bible. So that's all we're going to go by is the Bible. And this is not my opinion. Everything I'm going to be presenting is from the Bible so that we can get our own information from this. Jesus told us that our key indicator is that is what Daniel does in chapter 7, and he talks about this abomination, and he talks about it again in chapter 11 and 12, that same character. And Daniel 2, there is the dream, and this is something that's interesting. Daniel doesn't get this dream. Nebuchadnezzar gets the dream. And we remember the story of he gets the dream, and he's threatened to kill all the prophets in the land unless somebody can tell him what this dream said. And everybody's like, how can I tell you what your dream is? But then Daniel hears, and he says, okay, hey, let me go talk to Nebuchadnezzar. And he goes and talks to him, and he tells him, he said, there is a God who can tell you what you have dreamed, and he will tell you what that meaning is, and I am here to tell that to you. And Daniel tells him, it's not because he was something great. Daniel specifically tries to tell him, it's not because I, Daniel, am great. God has revealed it to me, so I'm going to tell you what he said. And he tells him about the statue with the golden head and everything. And as soon as Nebuchadnezzar finds out everything's going to be okay in his lifetime, he don't care about what happens after that. He's not really too worried about it. And then he goes on. But in Daniel 7, Daniel receives the vision himself. And in chapter 5, remember that he had the Belshazzar that had the many, many tickle up char, and it was written on the wall. That was another one that he was called in on. Wasn't a vision he received himself. But in chapter 7, he receives the vision of the 4 beasts. And we're going to look at that today. Chapter 7 is split basically in half. Verses 1 through 14 is where he tells us the vision. Then in 15, and that's what next week's lesson is when we see the angel explain it to him. One of the things we'll notice on this is that Daniel's curious about the 4th beast. He doesn't ask any questions about the first 3. Well, the first 3 would be very helpful to us trying to figure out who they are and how they fit into things, because everybody can have their opinions on what it is, but the angel didn't give Daniel any info because Daniel didn't ask. He was really concerned about that 4th beast. So that's all we have good info on. Chapter 8 is split into 2 parts. He gets a vision and then the interpretation. And then chapter 9, Daniel starts off with a prayer for Israel. And in the middle of that prayer for Israel, the angel comes back to him and tells him, says, okay, as soon as you started praying and seeking the truth, then we were dispatched to you. We were held up for a few days because of the battle they were fighting with the king of Persia, but said, now we are here, and I'm here to give you the message, and that takes us all the way through chapter 12. If we look at, we're going to be starting with 7:1, and so we'll let David, if you'll read 7:1 for us. We're going to do this pretty much one verse at a time. Every now and then we'll have 2 verses, but most of the time it's 1 verse at a time.
Earlier, during the first year of King Belshazzar's reign in Babylon, Daniel had a dream and saw visions as he lay in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and this is what he saw.
Okay. Now, in 5, 2, and 3, this is where, to set the stage, it tells us this. It says, Belshazzar, he was drinking wine, and he gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, and it tells us in the Bible, his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Okay, so this is like a major desecration. Nebuchadnezzar knew through the repeated interchanges with Daniel and through the golden statue that was going to get Daniel thrown into got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fiery furnace, through the Daniel in the lion's den. Well, Daniel in the lion's den was with Darius, so it was before that with Nebuchadnezzar. But everything he saw with Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar confessed to God. Now, he had his time of where he fell, and he sort of was severely lacking in humility, and made that proclamation, look at what I have done, and God struck him down, and 12 months later he had spent, they just tell us 7 times. That could be 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months. We didn't know for sure what it was, but it was 7 times that he was out in the fields eating the grass until he looked up to heaven and said, I recognize you are the God of heaven. And he had already done this once before with Daniel. As soon as Daniel interpreted his dream, he appointed Daniel to one of his head positions and made the proclamation. It tells us in the Bible that he fell on his knee, on his face, prostrate before Daniel and said, your God is the God. So Nebuchadnezzar had a couple of times, and I think that at the end he was pretty much believing in Daniel's God. Historical findings, though, tell us that Belshazzar was more likely a grandson than a son to Nebuchadnezzar. But they said it was common in that day for people to, son of, and you'd be stepping down one or two generations. It was, you just point back to your notable parent. And they said that they think that it was actually a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar married this other guy, and that was actually the dad of Belshazzar. But we don't know, and there's not a lot of information around at that time. But the historians generally placed his reign from 553 BC to 539. And he was killed when Cyrus overthrew Babylon. All right, so now let's pick up with 2 and 3. Now we got the stage set. This is Nebuchadnezzar. This is Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar's gone, and here's what he sees in verse 2. Clement.
Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of heaven strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another.
Okay, so this is the 4 winds of heaven. And the 4 winds of heaven are mentioned a few times in the Bible. And in Ezekiel 37:9, it says, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the 4 winds, and breathe into these that are slain, that they might live. And this is from the Valley of Dry Bones part. And so you see how the 4 winds are left there. In Revelation 7:1, it says, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, to prevent any wind from blowing on land or on the sea or on any tree. So we see at this part, he is going to tell us about these beasts. I missed 7:3 here. Oh, 7:2 and 3. Did you?
I read 2 and 3.
You did. Okay, good. So that's what I was wondering. Okay. And so we see at the end in 3 where it tells us these 4 great beasts, each are different from the others, and they come up out of the sea. We'll see in the interpretation that he tells them that they are 4 rulers that rise from the earth. So there must not be much of a difference. At first, you read this and you think it's from the sea, and Daniel sees it come up out of the sea. Well, where Daniel is hundreds of miles from any sea in any direction, in the middle of Babylon. So let's pick up with 4 now, Woody.
The first was like a lion, but it had eagle's wings. And as I watched, its wings were pulled off, so that it could no longer fly, and it was left standing on the ground on 2 feet like a man, and a man's mind was given to it.
Okay. Now this is an interesting one because he is telling us that he sees it. And it's really interesting to watch the wording here. The first was like a lion. He doesn't say it was a lion. It's like a lion. Are you going to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. And then he says that it had the wings of an eagle. Now there are theories, if you look through the commentaries, you have some people that are really study the eschatology and the end times and where we're at today, and they immediately talk about this as if this is exactly what Daniel sees. And they say that, okay, well, this is talking about the U.S. because our symbol is the eagle, torn away from England, whose symbol was the lion, and that's how we stood on our own 2 feet and became our own country. All right, so that's one of the theories that prevails out there. And then some of the other commentaries point out that this lion they're talking about actually symbolized Babylon, because Babylon's symbol and emblem was of a lion, and that's the way they were represented in the 5th and 6th century BC. All right, so that's the first one. He sees this first one come up out of the sea. So get that picture in your mind. Now let's look at 5, Stanley, and let's see what that tells us.
The second animal looked like a bear with its paws raised, ready to strike. It held 3 ribs between its teeth, and I heard a voice saying to it, "Get up, devour many people."
Okay. So we look at this one, and the commentaries I looked at, all the scholars were like, okay, what do we do with the 3 ribs? You know, they really couldn't come up with an answer as to how that fit. But generally they thought, and this is where they try to take history, and this is the one thing you have to be careful of. They try to take history and sort of, it may look like a square, and we got a round hole we're going to put it in, and if we get a big enough hammer, we can push it into that square hole and make it fit. Well, it doesn't necessarily, but some of the people think that this is Alexander the Great and his 4 generals. Well, that's in 6. And this one says they think it responds to the some conquered kingdoms that came along beforehand. And if you look back over history where you had Babylon and then Persia, and then you come along with the Greeks, that maybe it's those 3 empires. So now let's see what 6 tells us, Jerry.
After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it.
Okay. Now, this one is the one that looks like Alexander the Great. That's the historians matching what they have, because he had the 4 generals, and he was very fast. And his, they said that his army never had more than 35,000 people, but they moved extremely fast, and that's why he was able to conquer with the speed that he was. And he had these 4 generals, and we do know from history that these 4 generals, the empire, split into the 4, and that Seleucus here is the one that eventually became the Seleucids that Antiochus Epiphanes came from. So that's why they try and make this connection. And so that's just, what I'm wanting us to do is just hear what the Bible says, and then I'll toss out some of the things that the various commentaries say, but we're going to wait until next week and we get the translation from the angel. And again, the problem is we won't get a translation for the first 3, other than these are 3 kingdoms that arise. We get focused on the 4th one. All right, Jim, would you bless us with verse 7?
While I was watching in the night vision, a 4th beast appeared, frightening and dreadful, and incredibly strong, with large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed, and it trampled with its feet whatever was left. It was different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns.
Okay. Now, most commentators think that this matches up with the feet of iron and clay, that is into Daniel 2:40, on that particular one, and they say it's tied to the Roman Empire. But we're going to wait next week and see what the angel tells us it relates to. But when you look at this, Daniel has seen a lion, which is, by all symbols in the animal kingdom, that is ferocious. Then he sees a bear, which is also extremely ferocious, and this bear looks like he is poised for an attack. Then he sees this leopard, very fast cat, and it is like the lion, but it is also a ferocious beast as we would consider it. And all of that has just passed before him, and now he sees this other one that really just elevates. You just get this picture in mind of something on the order of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Just something that is so dramatically more powerful than anything he's seen before him, he doesn't even know how to explain it. And he sees that there's 10 horns, and we'll learn from the translation that the 10 horns are 10 rulers. Now, this particular one gets a lot of treatment in the eschatology and the prophecies and so forth that people look at as to this is that everybody thinks that this is tied to the Roman Empire and that the old Roman Empire has to be reborn, and this is going to be the European Union that's going to do it. Now, it's kind of hard to read this and see all that in it, all right? But that's what the general theories are, or the people that look at that. Okay, this is the European Union. Well, that worked out great in the 1950s when the European Union had its first 12 people, 12 countries in it, and they were thinking that's what that fits here. Then the 13th came on board. Now they're up to like 30 countries in the European Union. So it's like, okay, well, sort of something's blown that theory. Then it's like, okay, well, as soon as Britain started leaving, everybody's like, okay, well, the European Union's going to fall apart. Maybe it'll reassemble into what we're talking about here. There's so much we don't know that I think it's dangerous to try and pinpoint things, but it's also dangerous to not at least be aware of what the Bible tells us so that we can recognize when things happen. And we can't recognize it if we don't know. And yeah.
When we were talking about the wings and coming up out of the sea, and I can see that all of these powers that are there, the four great powers, have these atomic submarines that can destroy the whole world at this point in our life.
Mm-hmm.
And they come up out of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And they all have these wings that sit out on the side of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that really come up out of the sea,
I hadn't thought about the submarine part. Yeah.
they have two big wings on the front of them and two on the sail that's on their head, so it looks like a flying thing. But
Mm-hmm.
the awesome power that they have actually is enough to destroy the world.
Oh yeah.
And it could be done. And now we have the United States, we have Britain, we have
Russia.
China, and we have
Don't forget Russia.
Russia.
And India.
That are four powers that if they got into a conflict, there would be no New York, there would be no St. Petersburg, the world could be destroyed very quickly.
Oh yes.
And I'm wondering if anybody that ever looked at this thing has thought about the awesome power of the flying part of the submarines, because they can actually come up out of the water all the way up and just float back down like a bird.
Mm-hmm. Like one of those whales, you know.
Yeah, like you see on Pacific Dream or something, Line.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
So we're seeing these ferocious beasts, and I had not thought of a submarine as what it could be, but we'll see in next week how the translation goes from the angel. In verse 8 it says, "While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and the three of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully." Okay, so Daniel recognizes this, and he sees this come up, and we're going to get more into these horns. The horns, we're told, are going to be, it sort of uses the word kings and kingdom interchangeably, and so you don't know if it is a particular person that they're talking about or a kingdom. But one of the things to keep in mind is everything biblically, the kingdom is always recognized by its ruler. The kingdom follows the ruler. Whoever the ruler is what it is. And that's why all of Israel suffered when the kings didn't lead them, and all of Israel benefited when the kings led them back to God. And so the whole kingdom moves as to how they are related to God. So let's pick up with 9, and this is going to be like a scene change. And it's like, okay, if you're doing this as a movie director, you're watching this and you're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 beasts. Then all of a sudden you see these horns pop up, and you're totally perplexed with that. And then all of a sudden you cut to verse 9. David, please.
I watched as thrones were put in place, and the Ancient One sat down to judge. His clothing was as white as snow, his hair like purest wool. He sat on a fiery throne with wheels of blazing fire.
Okay, so we're seeing this Ancient of Days, which is God. In verse 13, it'll tell us that they see one like the Son of Man. To separate which one would be Jesus and which one would be God, Daniel is seeing two distinct scenes. All right, so let's go ahead and look at 10, because Daniel, it's like, okay, I'm watching this, I'm puzzled by these beasts, I'm puzzled by the horns that have popped up, and now all of a sudden, I'm sitting here looking at heaven, and I see God, and He has walked in and is sitting at the throne, and this throne has got this river of fire coming out from in front of it, and everything is totally different than what he's just been looking at. So let's see what 10 tells us over here to, you ready for it? Daniel chapter 7, verse 10, Jim Skelton.
All right.
A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him 1,000 thousands, ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened.
All right. So this is a totally different scene. And we see the books. The book of life is mentioned 6 times in the book of Revelation, and the book is opened, and the book is this, and the name who's written and not written in the book of life. And so we see that tying in on Revelation, but Daniel's showing us this book that he sees, and court was seated. So he's looking on, and all of heaven is seated. You got 100 million people that are watching, and you have thousands upon thousands that are attending to God. All right? So let's see what we see in 11 now. Moving over to Clement.
I beheld then because of the voice of the great word which the horn spake. I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame.
This ties in with Revelation 19:19 that John saw in his vision. He said, "Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army." That's Jesus, and he's bringing the army with him. "But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed the signs and wonders on its behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The 2 of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur." And so he's telling us, this is Daniel seeing, and he's watching until this horn that's speaking, which is going to be the Antichrist, which is going to be the one that's talked of in Revelation. He sees him thrown into the lake of fire, the blazing fire. All right? So let's see what 13 tells us. Woody? 12, my bad.
As for the other 3 animals, their kingdoms were taken from them, but they were allowed to live a short time longer.
Okay, yeah, 12. Okay, there it is. And so in this part, it's telling us that these beasts have been stripped of their authority. Now, usually when, a conqueror takes over, they kill the people they've conquered. They don't. They want to put their own people in power. And so in this particular case, they've lost their authority, but they're allowed to keep living for a period of time. All right, so let's pick up now, Stanley, with 13.
Next I saw the arrival of a man, for so he seemed to be, brought there from the clouds on heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was presented to him.
All right, and then 14, Jerry.
Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
All right, that's a really good description of what would be Jesus. I think we're on safe ground to say that after what Jesus says about himself, and he talks about the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God, that this is exactly the fulfillment of that prophecy when Jesus came. But we see this. So Daniel, he is seeing this person. This is 550 years before Jesus is born. He is seeing this prophecy that shows him God, the Ancient of Days, sitting on the throne, and he sees the throne of heaven. He sees the wheels in front of him that are let's say it tells us that the wheels were all ablaze. So he sees this. This is similar to what Ezekiel had seen with the wheel within the wheel and the flaming wheels that lifted up. So we see the comparison of some of that symbolism working for us. But now he comes in and he sees Jesus come in. And Jesus is allowed to go into his presence. We may not know who these 10,000 and 10,000 times 10,000 or the 1,000 times 1,000 are. There's, lots of different positions you can look at. They could be all angels. We have no idea how many angels there are. And then on the other hand, it could be he's looking far enough into the future, he may be seeing Revelation chapter 19 when the court is seated and now God is going to judge everybody. And the 10,000 times 10,000 could be the saints that have been resurrected spirits that he's seeing. We don't know, and we're not given enough information even in the interpretation later for that particular part. But it's a really spectacular scene Daniel is seeing. He shifted his vision from this, but then he keeps seeing this little horn that is very boastful and challenging God and saying things against God.
Now looking at 12, it says, as for the other three animals, their kingdoms were taken from them, but they were allowed to live a short time longer.
Mm-hmm.
Now what three kingdoms would that be, I suppose?
And that's the thing that we don't. That's the thing that we don't know about, because if you remember back on this other part where he tells us in verse 8, while he was thinking about the horns, that's the 10 horns, he says, there before him was another horn. And it says, and he says, and it came up among them. So we would take that, when we see the interpretation next week, we see that as a ruler, that maybe he rose from one of the 10, he rose up. And it then says that the three horns were uprooted before it. He may have taken over these three, or they may have gone their own way, or this may be the three that he's talking about when we get over here to verse 12, is that they're allowed to live. But it says uprooted before it. And then it talks about his horn had the eyes like the human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. And we'll see this horn metaphor carried forward into the future with some of the other Daniel visions. And you have to just wonder, what are we talking about when we think about this? And it's so easy to want to desperately want to try and match it up to something that we understand. That's exactly what Daniel was going through. He wanted to match it up to what he understood. But what he understood was, and if you look at Daniel's life, and Nebuchadnezzar had brought him in as a young boy, probably 10, 11, 12 years old, and he had been raised in the king's educational system and in the palace, and he was one of the closest and the smartest ones to the palace. But he didn't have really any authority until he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. When he told him what his dream was and interpreted that, Nebuchadnezzar recognized, okay, this guy is talking to somebody else that I am not familiar with. I need to stay close to him. And so he elevated him, and then he asked, it tells us at the end of 2 that he asked if he could promote Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be working for him, which he did. And so you had a really interesting thing. This is Daniel. He's with the Babylonian kingdom. And normally, when a ruler comes in, he sees several different rulers in his time over that same land. Because if Belshazzar was actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, then he was there through Nabonius' time, which is the one they think this guy named Nabonius was Belshazzar's dad. And so he ruled for a number of years before Belshazzar got to rule. And then Daniel got to see them wiped out in a fell swoop. They said it was a very quick strike that the Persians made, and now he stays in power under Darius, then he stays in power under Cyrus, and so Daniel gets to be involved in all these different kingdoms, and he's seen these people come and go. And so, as we'll see also, he mentions in next chapter, I think, or chapter 9, he talks about in chapter 9, he's talking about he goes back to Jeremiah's prophecy. And Jeremiah says, hey, you're going to be in Babylon for 70 years. And so the 70 years is nearly up. And so Daniel's praying to God okay, I want to remind you, God, you said we'd be here 70 years. So now might be a good time to, revisit that promise you made. And that's when he goes in, and as we remember the letter he gets from Cyrus, or not he, but when Ezra and they want to go back, and Zerubbabel wants to go back and build it up. That's when they get the letter telling them to go back and build the temple and everything. And we'll bring all that in at the right time as well. But anyhow, I wanted us to set the stage so we get to where we know what we're talking about, and then next week is when we're going to see this interpretation. And the interpretation is just as challenging to understand it, because you're like, well, that didn't, interpretation doesn't tell me a whole lot. But we need to really be looking at these things, and I'm really excited about all the things we've got coming ahead of us. Do y'all have any other questions or comment on the first half of Daniel chapter 7? Y'all gonna be ready for next week now? Y'all.
one thing you can remember is that God tells us, won't worry about any of this, because worry is not going to keep you on this earth not one day longer.
Well, the worry is a different thing than knowing about it.
But you can't hardly know about all this unless you worry a little bit.
I use the word study.
How close it is, because we don't know how close it is either.
We don't. There could be 1,000 years ahead of us. That's why everything that we're seeing, you don't know. You just have to go. So it's a very good point. You have no idea as to when it is. But Jesus did tell us, and this is the part we'll get to, when he tells us in Matthew that when you see your Israel be reborn, that's the start. In other words, until 1948, from 70 AD until 1948, there was nothing. It was the time of the church. God was using that time to reach the Gentile world, and the gospel has been spreading across the world during that time period. But at the time he reawakens the nation of Israel, he tells us, and all of the prophets tell us, when Israel comes back, as they did in 1948, they will never again be overthrown. They will not be overthrown. Now in Daniel, we will see that they will spend 3.5 years with this agreement that they're going to make. But that's not being overthrown. They've just entered into an agreement for 3.5 years. And that's what we have to be watching for. So that's the reason until May of 1948, there was no reason to be worried about anything end-time prophecy-wise, because the most important event had not occurred. Now that the most important event has occurred, it's interesting.
We don't have to worry about Iran at all then, do we?
Well, they're part of Persia, remember? And some of the kingdoms that we see in here match up with the Persian Empire. That's what Daniel was in the middle of living in.
But if Israel's never going to be overthrown again, then Iran will never be.
Oh, Iran's never going to overthrow them. And Russia's not going to. That doesn't mean they're not going to attack them.
There's going to be war.
Yeah.
There's going to be war.
Oh, yeah. Ferocious wars. Wars like the world has never seen before.
1/3 of the population will be killed in the wars and all that.
Yeah, when you look back and you total up the percentages of people that are going to be gone, that are going to be killed in the prophecies of Revelation, you're easily losing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the whole population of the planet. That's worse than any war we've ever seen. And this doesn't even give us numbers for the people who die in the pestilence and the plagues that God pours out on the earth. So yeah, it's going to be really bad.
And blood will flow up to the bridle.
Mm-hmm. In Megiddo. Uh-huh.
I heard Dr. Jeremiah say that it would take 9 months for all the volatiles to eat the people up that has died.
Yeah, the birds of the air are going to fill themselves with their flesh. We see that in Ezekiel too. So, yeah, there's so much that happens, and the reason it's important now is because we are in that time period. Another reason that I think it's important now for us, and what we see every day, is you hear the term fake news, okay? And how much deceptive information is hitting the pipeline today. You can see video clips of people saying things they really didn't say. Somebody has masterfully edited everything that they're saying to make them say what they didn't say. You see photos that put people in positions and in places with other people that the photo was never taken. And the technology exists today for us to be deceptive on a level never imagined by man in the past. We just never could get to that level of deception. And that's why everything is so important that we have to be intensely focused on not being deceived, because we certainly can be. As I pointed out earlier, when you get back to the fact that, to me, Joshua was just one of the icons of the church. And the whole nation of Israel, he was such a powerful leader and so close to God in all that he did, and he was deceived. And of course, Jesus, as I started at the beginning, is talking to his 12 disciples, one of which he knows has already deceived him and betrayed him. He's talking to them. And so anybody can be deceived if you're not seriously and intensely focused on God. All right, so let me close this in prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the messages that you have given us and the signs you have given us. And we know that the messages are incomplete because we're to turn to you to fill in the missing information. This is where prophecy and prayer go hand in hand. We must avoid going and reading and listening and thinking of any of these things without turning to you and asking you, what do these things mean? And listening for your answer. Be with us now as we go this week and help all the others around us see us and help us to show you in all that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now I'll be taking the videos and putting the video on a Facebook page I've created, and I'll send it to you, and I'll also put it on a web page for those that don't do Facebook, so you'll be able to keep up with it if you missed. And then as Jim pointed out, and one of the good things about this is if I'm going to miss, so I got the video, I'll just do the video of the lesson at the house, and he can plug it into TV and let it play. So that'll help us keep from missing, getting off track on this. All right then, well thank y'all. I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes.
Thanks, George.